I have spent my working life turning other people's voices into rows. That is the whole of the trade. A signal comes in off the deep array, raw and screaming with noise, and you strip the noise away and you fix the carrier and you align the frames, and at the end of all that labor you have a table. Sender, receiver, time, content. The content is the last column because the content is the part you understand least and trust least and have to argue for most. I had been doing it for 31 years when the Halloran intercept came across my deck, and I want to be precise about what kind of man received it, because the precision matters later. I was not a soldier. I had never fired a weapon at anything that could fire back. I was a clerk of the airwaves, 63 years old, with bad knees and a good ear, stationed at Tessel Watch because Tessel Watch was as far from anything as a man could be sent and still be useful. We hung in the dark at the edge of the call, 410 of us, listening to a galaxy that did not know we were there. The call is a band of cold dust that runs between our reach and theirs. We had named it. The Senar, as far as we ever learned, had not named it, because the Senar did not name things that did not serve a function, and a band of dust served no function. That was the first thing I understood about them, long before the rest, and it should have been a warning. A people who do not name the empty places are a people who have decided in advance what is empty. The intercept arrived on the 9th of the month, queued behind 200 routine captures, and it would have sat in that queue another full shift if a junior named Pell had not flagged the carrier as anomalous. She came to my station with the flag still blinking, and she said, the way the young say things when they are trying not to seem afraid of being wrong, that the modulation looked like a conquered administrative band, but the volume was enormous. Administrative bands do not carry volume. Administrative bands carry orders and confirmations, and the small, dry traffic of a bureaucracy running itself. This one carried a river. I told her to align it and route it to me, and then I told her to go get her rest, because she had been on for 11 hours and the river was not going anywhere. She went. I have thought about that since, that I sent her to her bunk so she would not be at my shoulder for what came out of the alignment. I did not know what was coming. I only knew that I did my best work alone and that whatever this was, it was going to require my best work. Both things were true. The kindness in it was an accident. It took me the better part of the night to break the frame structure. The Concord wrote its records in nested patterns, the way they did everything, a thing inside a thing inside a thing, and you could not simply read it top to bottom. You had to find the index, and the index pointed you to the keys, and the keys unfolded the body, and the body, when it unfolded, was not a message at all. It was an archive. A complete administrative archive of an operation, transmitted from a forward unit back to a Concord depot for, as the header stated in its flat, unhurried way, permanent retention and future reference. The operation had a designation that translated to nothing useful, a string of their function glyphs, but the location resolved cleanly because the Concord logged coordinates in absolute terms, and absolute terms are absolute everywhere. I ran the resolution twice. Then I sat with my hands flat on the cold metal of the deck, and I made myself run it a third time, because the coordinates were ours. They were Halloran's Reach. I should tell you what Halloran's Reach was, because the Concord's archive did not bother to, and the failure to bother is the heart of this whole account. Halloran's Reach was a farming colony on the cold side of the call, a single continent's worth of people who had gone out 40 years before to grow protein grain in long sealed valleys under artificial sun. 1,140 of them at the last census. They were not strategic. They had no fleet, no foundry, no weapon larger than the seismic charges they used to open new valleys. They grew grain and they shipped it inward, and they raised their children in the valleys and buried their dead in a field above the main settlement that they had walled in stone because the wind out there was cruel and they wanted the markers to last. I had read the colony's own civic records years before, in a different decade, for a different reason, and I remembered the wall around the burial field. I remembered it because the records noted, with the small pride such records carry, that the wall had been built by hand, course by course, by people who could have machined it in a week, and chose not to. The conquered archive had a different account of Halloran's Reach, and the difference between the two accounts is the only thing this story is really about. I read it the way I read everything, column by column, because that is the only way I know how to keep my hands steady. The archive opened with a survey. The forward unit had arrived in the system, observed the colony, and assessed it. The assessment was not military. It was inventory. The Senar did not see 1,140 people. They saw, in the cold arithmetic of their language, 1,140 viable biological instances of a species not previously catalogued in their pattern archives, residing on a body of negligible defensive value. And then the archive recorded the unit's decision, and the decision was logged as a routine procedural matter, the way you or I might log a decision to file a folder or close an account. They decided to preserve the colony. I want to be careful here, because the word preserve is going to do a great deal of work, and I need you to understand exactly how the Senar meant it. To the Senar, a person was a pattern. The Senar did not die, not in the way we die. When a Senar's body failed, the conquered drew that Senar's pattern from the Genesis vaults, the great archives where every Senar's complete template was held, and printed a new body, a fresh instance, and into that instance they loaded the pattern, and the Senar continued. Death, to them, was an interruption in service, a delay, a bureaucratic inconvenience to be smoothed over by the foundries. They had been doing it so long that they no longer had a concept of an end. They had instances and they had patterns, and the instance was the cheap part, and the pattern was the valuable part. And as long as the pattern was held in the vault, nothing of importance had been lost. So when the forward unit at Halloran's Reach found a new species, an uncatalogued species, the unit did what its procedures required. It preserved the patterns. It went down into the valleys and it took the colonists, all 1,140, and it scanned them, read them down to the cell, to the synapse, to whatever the Senar read a living thing down to, and it wrote those readings into its pattern archive. 1,140 complete human templates. Men, women, the 400 and some children, the eldest colonist who was 103 and the youngest who was 11 days. Every one of them read and filed and stored, exactly as the Senar stored their own. The archive recorded the completion of the scan as a success. The unit had, by its own lights, done these people a kindness. It had made them, for the first time in their poor mortal history, recoverable. And then, the scan complete and the patterns safely written, the unit disposed of the instances. That is the word the archive used, disposed. The living bodies, the people, the actual breathing people who had built a wall by hand because they wanted their markers to last, were, in the unit's procedural language, redundant. The pattern was held. The instance was surplus. And surplus biological material on a body of negligible value is by conquered procedure to be reclaimed, which is to say burned, because biomass burned cleanly is biomass returned to the system, and biomass left standing is biomass left to rot, and the Senar did not tolerate waste. The archive logged the reclamation in a single line. It logged the energy yield. It logged the completion time. 4 hours and some minutes to reduce 1,140 living human beings to clean ash, and the unit recorded that it had run somewhat ahead of schedule, and it transmitted the whole archive back to the depot for permanent retention, and then it moved on to its next survey, satisfied, untroubled, certain it had done no wrong, because in its own arithmetic nothing had been lost. The patterns were safe. The people were filed. Should the species ever be needed, it could be reprinted. I sat at my deck, and I read the energy yield of the reclamation, and I understood that I was looking at the temperature at which my own kind burns. I did not weep. I want to be honest about that, because I have heard men say that in such a moment they wept, and perhaps they did, but I did not. I have wondered since whether something was wrong with me. I think now that it was simpler than that. I had spent 31 years turning voices into rows, and the archive in front of me was a row, the cruelest row I had ever fixed, and the habit of the work held my hands steady when nothing else would have. I checked the alignment. I verified the keys. I confirmed the coordinates a fourth time and a fifth. I built the table, sender and receiver and time and content, and I did not let myself feel the content until the table was clean. And by the time the table was clean, it was nearly morning, and the thing I felt was not grief. Exactly. Grief came later and stayed a long time. What I felt first, alone on the deck with the river finally stilled into rose, was a cold so total and so quiet that I understood it was going to need somewhere to go. I sent it up the chain the way I was supposed to. That is the part of the trade that does not get spoken of, that after you have fixed the worst thing you will ever read, you package it and you route it and you fill in the priority field, and the system absorbs it, and you are left at your deck with your cold and your habit and nothing to do but begin the next capture. I did not begin the next capture. I sat. Pell came back on shift and found me there and did not ask, because she had been long enough at Tessel Watch to know that a man sitting like that has read something, and you do not ask. She brought me a cup of the bitter ration tea and set it down at my elbow and went to her own deck, and I heard her, an hour later, make a small sound, because the archive had been copied to her queue as well, and she had reached the reclamation line. I went over and stood at her shoulder the way I had not let her stand at mine. She was 26. She looked up at me and she said, and I have never forgotten it, that they had not even hated us. She had read it correctly. There was no hatred in the archive anywhere. Hatred would have been a kind of acknowledgement, a kind of relationship, a recognition that the thing you destroy is a thing that matters enough to destroy. There was none of that. There was inventory and procedure and a satisfied note about running ahead of schedule. We had been to the Senar, a filing task. I told Pell that she was right, that they had not hated us, and that this was worse, and that she should drink her tea, and I took my own cold cup back to my deck and I began, because I did not know what else to do with myself, to read the rest of the archive. There was a great deal more of it. The Halloran operation was one entry. The depot it had been transmitted to held thousands. That was the second thing I came to understand in the gray weeks after, as I worked the depot traffic that came spilling through the same band now that I knew where to listen. Halloran's reach was not special. It was not a war crime in the Senar's eyes because the Senar had no concept that would let it be a crime. It was ordinary. It was procedure. The depot was a permanent retention archive for a civilization that had been doing this, preserving and reclaiming, filing and burning, across its whole long history, to its own dead first and then to anyone else who fell within its surveys. The Genesis vaults held the patterns of every Senar who had ever lived and every species the Conquered had ever catalogued, and the foundries stood ready to print any of them. And to the Senar this was not horror, it was immortality. It was the great achievement of their civilization. They had abolished the end. And because they had abolished the end for themselves, they had abolished its weight for everyone, and they walked into a farming colony on the cold side of the call, and they filed 1,140 people, and burned them and ran ahead of schedule and felt nothing at all. I built a map. That was my contribution, and I am not ashamed of it, though there are men who would say a clerk of the airwaves had no business in what came after. The depot traffic, once I had the keys, was a confession of pure structure. The Senar logged everything in absolute coordinates, because absolute coordinates are absolute everywhere. And the Genesis vaults, being the most valuable installations in their entire civilization, were referenced constantly. Every reclamation cross-checked against the vault that held the pattern, every print order routed from a vault to a foundry, every audit of capacity, every transfer of stored templates from one vault to another for redundancy. The Conquered had built its immortality on records, and the records told me, line by patient line, where every vault in their territory stood. I spent 4 months reading. At the end of it I had the location of every Genesis vault the pattern Conquered owned, not the fleets, not the foundry worlds where the instances were grown. The vaults, the pattern archives, the place where the Senar kept the thing they valued and the only thing they could not, by the logic of their own civilization, afford to lose. I did not build the map for myself. I built it because the question had already been asked, far above me, in rooms I would never see, and the question was not whether Earth would answer. The question was what an answer to this even meant. You cannot deter a people who do not fear death. You cannot punish soldiers whose deaths are an interruption in service. You cannot make the Senar grieve their burned instances, because the Senar do not grieve, any more than you grieve a deleted draft when you hold the master file. Every conventional shape of retaliation broke against the simple fact of the vaults. Burn their fleet and they reprint the crews. Take their foundry world and they build another and reprint the workers. There was no body you could strike that they could not regrow, no loss you could inflict that they could not undo, because they had abolished the end. Except for one thing. The patterns were not infinite. The vaults were not redundant beyond a point. A pattern was the most valuable thing the conquered possessed precisely because, once truly lost, it could not be recovered. There was no template of the template. If the vault burned and the backup vault burned and every copy and every redundancy chain burned, then the pattern was gone, and the Senar held in those vaults was gone, finally and forever, in the only way the Senar had ever feared and had spent their whole history engineering away. The vaults were where finality lived in their world. They had built their entire civilization to wall finality out, course by course, the way the colonists of Halloran's Reach had walled in their burial field, and they had succeeded so completely that they had forgotten what stood on the other side of the wall. I understood this from the records before anyone above me put it into a directive, and I think they understood it too, in those rooms I never saw, because the directive when it came was shaped exactly like the truth. It did not order an attack on the Senar fleet. It did not order the seizure of foundry worlds. It designated an operation and a fleet under a single name, the last edition, and it gave that fleet one task, defined with a clerk's precision that I recognized and that, I will admit, I was proud to have helped make possible. The last edition would go to the vaults, every vault, every backup, every link in every redundancy chain in a single coordinated reach so that no pattern transferred ahead of the strike could survive in a copy elsewhere. And it would unmake them, not the foundries, not the instances, the patterns. The last edition would do to the Senar's stored dead exactly what the Senar had done to the living of Halloran's Reach, with one difference that was the whole of the message. We would not file them first. I have heard the word disproportion used about what followed and used as an accusation, and I have never argued with it because it was disproportionate, and the disproportion was the point. 1,140 people on a body of negligible value, and Earth answered by unmaking the accumulated immortality of an entire civilization. There is no proportion in it. There was never meant to be. Proportion is a conversation between equals who agree on what a thing is worth, and the Senar and Earth did not agree, could not agree, on what 1,140 people were worth, because to the Senar they were instances, and to us they were the only 1,140 of themselves there would ever be. The disproportion was the translation. It was the one sentence we could say in a tongue the Senar would finally understand. The tongue of finality, which they had spent 10,000 years forgetting how to speak. We were going to teach it back to them. I did not go to a vault on the first wave. A man my age, a signals clerk, does not ride a strike, but the directive attached me to the operation as an analyst, and so I left Tessel Watch for the first time in 9 years and I rode inward to the staging point. And from the staging point I watched the last edition assemble, and I will tell you what it looked like, because I think the men who came after deserve to know it was not what they will imagine. It did not look like rage. I had braced myself, somewhere underneath the cold, for rage, for a howling, chaotic fleet flung outward in grief, for crews painted with the names of the dead, for the ugly improvised fury of people who have been wounded past reason. There was none of that. The last edition assembled in daylight, under the cold blue sun of the staging world, in long ordered ranks, and the ranks were quiet. The crews were briefed and drilled and rebriefed. The flight plans were checked, and the targeting solutions were checked against my map and checked again, and a third time, because the operation depended on simultaneity, on every vault and every backup being reached inside the same narrow window so that no pattern could be transferred ahead of the strike. And simultaneity across that many coordinates is an arithmetic problem of brutal difficulty. And we solved it the way you solve any brutal arithmetic problem, which is slowly, carefully. With a clerk's patience over weeks. There was grief in that staging world. I felt it everywhere, the way you feel cold in your knees, a constant pressure under everything. But the grief did not drive the work. The work drove the grief, downward and inward, packed it tight, made of it something dense and quiet and aimed. I have never in my life seen so many people so angry behave so calmly. It frightened me more than any fury would have, because fury burns out, and what I was watching had no intention of burning out. It intended to arrive. We captured a Senar in the staging weeks. A forward scout, taken from a disabled craft on the fringe of the call, brought inward for interrogation, and I was asked to sit in because I had read more Senar traffic than anyone alive and might catch a nuance the linguists missed. I want to set down what passed in that room, because it is the closest I ever came to the thing itself, the alien fact at the bottom of all of this, and because I think a man who reads this account deserves to know that we did not strike at a monster. We struck at something that did not know it was one. The Senar sat across the table. I will not describe its body in detail. It is enough to say that it was made, not born, that it had the smooth uniformity of a thing printed to a template, and that its eyes, if you can call them that, tracked us with an attention that was total and entirely without warmth. It answered every question we asked. It had no reason not to. It did not fear us, because it could not fear what we might do to it. Its pattern was held in a vault 40 light-years away, and whatever happened to this instance, the Senar that sat across from us would continue, would be reprinted, would resume. It told us this plainly when we asked why it was so calm. It told us that it found our methods of interrogation inefficient, since we seemed to believe that the threat of harm to its instance would compel it, and it did not understand why we thought the instance mattered. A captain in the room, a hard, quiet woman named Adami, who commanded one of the lead elements of the last edition, asked the Senar whether it knew what its people had done at Halloran's Reach. The linguists rendered the coordinates. The Senar consulted some internal record and confirmed that an operation had occurred there, that a new species had been catalogued and preserved, that the instances had been reclaimed on schedule. It said this without any change in its attention. Adami asked it whether it understood that the instances it referred to had been people. The word people gave the linguists trouble. In the end they rendered it as singular irreplaceable patterns, which was as close as the Senar tongue could come, and the Senar considered the phrase, and then it told us in the flat, unhurried way of all their records that the patterns had not been lost. The patterns were preserved. It seemed to think this was reassurance. It seemed to think it was telling us something kind. It said, and the linguists rendered it carefully, and I have never forgotten the rendering, that nothing of value had ended, and that it did not understand our distress, because to be preserved was the highest condition, and we should be grateful that our kind had been found worthy of the vaults. Adami did not raise her voice. I had braced for it, and it did not come. She thanked the Senar for its answers, which confused it, and she stood, and she said one thing before she left the room, and she said it to the linguists and not to the Senar, so that I am not certain the Senar ever understood it. She said, "It thinks the vault is mercy." Then she went out, and the rest of us went out after her, and the Senar sat alone in the room, entirely calm, certain it had done no wrong, certain that nothing of value could end, waiting to be returned to a war in which it could not die. I have thought about that sentence of Adami's more than almost anything else from those weeks. It thinks the vault is mercy, because the whole of the last edition, the whole of what we became in those weeks, was the slow, cold construction of a single reply to that one belief. We were going to go to the vaults the Senar thought were mercy, and we were going to show them what mercy had hidden from them for 10,000 years, which is that an end is not the absence of value. An end is what gives the value its weight. A thing that cannot be lost cannot be loved, and a people who cannot lose cannot grieve, and a people who cannot grieve will walk into a farming valley and file 1,140 souls and run ahead of schedule and feel that they have been kind. The strike went in on a day I can give you the date of but will not, because the date became a thing afterward, a thing spoken too easily, and I would rather it stay a number in a record where it belongs. I was not at a vault. I was at the staging world, at a long bank of decks, with my map up on the wall, watching the confirmations come in, and what I did for the duration of the operation was the only thing I have ever known how to do. I turned voices into rows. The last edition reached the vaults in its narrow, simultaneous window. Every one of them, every backup, every link in every chain, exactly as the arithmetic had required. And as each element reached its target, it transmitted a confirmation, and I logged the confirmations. And the map on the wall went dark coordinate by coordinate as the vaults that had stood for 10,000 years stopped being places where anything was held. I will not pretend it was clean. Nothing of that scale is clean. There were vaults defended, and the defense was real, and we lost ships and we lost crews, and those crews did not have patterns waiting in any archive, and they did not come back, because we were the kind of people for whom that was always true, and it was for exactly that reason that we were the ones doing this. I logged those losses too in their own rows, sender and time and the cold final content, and I have carried them since alongside the rest. But the operation held. The simultaneity held. The Senar, deep in the assurance of their immortality, had never built the vaults to be defended against an enemy who wanted the patterns and not the instances, because no enemy had ever wanted such a thing, because no enemy had ever understood that the patterns were where finality could be made to live. We understood. I had spent 4 months learning it from their own records, and the last edition spent a single day teaching it back. And here is the part that I think no one who was not there will ever quite believe, and that I would not believe myself if I had not logged the traffic with my own hands. The Senar did not understand what was happening to them until it had already happened. Their communications during the strike were not the communications of a people under existential attack. They were the communications of a bureaucracy registering an anomaly. Vault losses were logged. Pattern transfer protocols were initiated and failed because every destination in every chain was being unmade in the same window, and there was nowhere to transfer to. The Concord's traffic in those hours has the quality of a man padding his pockets for a key he has always had. In a rising disbelief that is not yet fear because the man has never in his life had to be afraid of a locked door. The fear came later. It came when the strike was over and the surviving Senar instances, the soldiers, the crews, the scouts like the calm one in our room began, one by one in the ordinary course of their war to die. A ship destroyed, a crew lost, a scout taken. And the Concord reached into the vaults to draw the patterns and reprint them, as it had done for 10,000 years, as reliably as you or I draw breath, and the patterns were not there. The vaults were ash. There was no template of the template, and the Senar who died after the last edition did not come back, and the Concord understood slowly, instance by instance, in a dawning that I tracked in their traffic over the weeks that followed, that for the first time in their entire history their dead were staying dead. They had no procedure for it. That was the thing that came through the traffic most clearly, the thing that told me the reply had landed. They had 1,000,000 words for copy and preserve and reclaim and restore, and not one word, anywhere in their language, for the thing that was now happening to them, because they had abolished the thing so long ago that the word had fallen out of use. We had to watch them invent it. Across the weeks after the last edition, in the depot traffic I kept reading because I could not stop. I watched the Senar language reach for a concept it had discarded and build it back up from nothing, clumsily, the way a man rebuilds a wall he tore down in his arrogance, and the concept it built was grief. They learned to grieve. We taught them. It was the most terrible thing I have ever done, and I helped to do it on purpose, and I would help to do it again. And I have made my peace with both of those facts, and the peace is not comfortable, and I do not want it to be. Adami survived the operation. Many did not. She came back through the staging world on her way inward, and she stopped at my deck, because someone had told her that the analyst who built the map was an old signals clerk from Tessel Watch, and she wanted, she said, to see the man who had read it all first. I told her there was nothing to see. She looked at my map, dark now, every coordinate gone out, and she asked me whether I thought it had been worth it. I have been asked that question many times since, by younger people who want me to either absolve them or accuse them, and I have learned to recognize when a person wants an answer, and when a person only wants company in the asking. Adami wanted neither. She had done the thing. She was past the question. She asked it the way you test a floor you have already decided to walk across. I told her the truth, which was that worth was the Senar's word, the vault keeper's word. The word of people who think value is a thing you can hold in an archive and weigh against a cost. I told her I did not think in worth. I thought in finality. And the only finality that had ever mattered, the only one that could not be filed or copied or reclaimed or run ahead of schedule, was the 1140 of Halloran's Reach, who had built a wall by hand because they wanted their markers to last, and who were now, every one of them, held in a Senar vault that no longer existed, their patterns ash alongside the patterns of the people who had filed them. They were gone twice over now, burned once as instances and erased once as patterns. There was no recovering them. There had never been any recovering them. The vault had been a lie wearing the shape of mercy. All the last edition had done was make the Senar live inside the same truth they had walked into our colony and assumed away. Adami nodded at that slowly, the way you nod at a thing you already knew but needed to hear in another voice. Then she said the only thing either of us said that I think was meant for the record, though neither of us was keeping one in that moment. She said that the Senar had built their whole civilization to make sure nothing ever ended, and that we had crossed the call to teach them the one fact their immortality had cost them, which is that a thing that cannot end cannot matter, and that the burning of Halloran's Reach was not a war crime to them precisely because they had made themselves into a people for whom nothing could be a crime, because nothing could be lost. We did not return what they had taken. You cannot. We only made certain that the people who took it would, at last, understand the size of what they had done, not by being told, because they could not be told, but by being made to stand where we stand, where every one of us has always stood, at the cold edge of the wall, on the side where things end. I went back to Tessel Watch after. There was still a galaxy to listen to. The conquered did not attack us again. A people learning grief for the first time has no attention to spare for conquest, and in any case the lesson, once delivered, did not need repeating, which is the whole virtue of finality as a language. You say it once. I returned to my deck and my Rose and Pell, who had made full analysts by then, and the river of the galaxy went on coming in raw and screaming, and I went on stripping the noise away and fixing the carriers and building the tables, sender and receiver and time and content. The content last because it is the part you trust least and have to argue for most. I am an old man now, and I will not see another posting. People who learn what I did come sometimes, the way Adami came, wanting to know whether it was a great thing or a terrible one, and I tell them it was both, and that the both does not divide, that it is one thing seen from the only place a person can stand to see it. But when they press me, when they want the line, the thing to carry away, I tell them what I tell myself on the nights the cold comes back into my knees and will not leave. I tell them that the Senar had a vault for every soul that ever lived and called it mercy, and that mercy was the lie, because a soul you can always get back is a soul you never have to be careful with. And I tell them that the last edition was not vengeance, whatever the records say, and was not justice, because there is no justice that fits 1140 people burned to run ahead of schedule. It was a translation. It was the one true sentence we had, said back to the people who could not otherwise have heard it, in the only tongue no vat could ever copy and no foundry ever reprint. We made them count. That was all of it. For 10,000 years they had not had to, and we crossed the call and we put a number in their language that only goes down, and we did not give them the courtesy they had not given us. We did not file them first. The colonists of Halloran's Reach built a wall by hand because they wanted their markers to last. I think about that wall more than I think about the vaults. The wall is gone now too. There was nothing left of the colony to keep it standing, but it lasted exactly as long as it was meant to. It lasted until the people who built it were taken. A marker is not for the dead. A marker is the living saying in stone in their own hands that an end happened here and that the end has weight, and that the weight is the whole of the meaning. The Senar had no markers because the Senar had no ends. We brought them both, in a single day, across the call, and we did not stay to see them learn to grieve. I logged the last confirmation myself. I built the final row. Sender, the last edition. Time, the narrow window holding. Content, the only content there had ever really been. The content I had carried since the 9th of the month when the river first stilled into rose under my hands. The vaults were ash. The patterns were gone. The dead, all of them, theirs and ours, were finally and equally dead. And for the first time in 10,000 years that word meant, on both sides of the call, exactly what it has always meant for us. I closed the table. I have not opened it since. Some rows you fix once and then you carry, and the carrying is the marker, built by hand, meant to last.